What happens when all hope is lost? When the vast western frontier becomes not a land of opportunity, but a desolate prison of isolation and despair? They say history is written by the victors. But what about those who were pushed to the edge of existence, whose stories were deemed unworthy of telling? Not today, not on my land. In the shadow of America's westward expansion, a different kind of courage emerged. Not in conquering the land, but in refusing to let another soul surrender to darkness. This isn't just a rescue story. This is about what happens when two broken people, rejected by society for different reasons, discover something profound. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and I promise you. Voice lowers dramatically. The final revelation will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Before we dive into this powerful tale, if this is your first time here at the Black Rancher channel, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell right now. These untold stories from America's past deserve to be heard, and I don't want you to miss a single one. These aren't just stories. They're pieces of our forgotten history that can change how we see ourselves today. Now let's begin Chapter 1 of a journey that will stay with you long after the video ends. Colorado Territory, November 1875. The Rocky Mountains stood as silent witnesses to human suffering, their snow-capped peaks indifferent to the small figure making her way along the treacherous mountain path. Elizabeth Turner stumbled forward, her wedding dress torn and muddied, her face streaked with dried tears. The November wind cut through the thin fabric, but she barely felt the cold anymore. 3 days earlier, she had stood before a church full of strangers in Denver, waiting for a man she'd never met, a rancher who had answered her advertisement in a matrimonial newspaper, a man who had promised her a home, security, perhaps even affection eventually. But when Elizabeth had stepped off the stagecoach, the whispers had begun immediately. That can't be her. He didn't say she'd be so plain. Look at those scars on her face. The pockmarks from childhood smallpox that had already made her a pariah back east now marked her as undesirable in the West as well. When her intended groom had seen her, his expression had shifted from anticipation to disgust, then finally to cold calculation. He'd gone through with the ceremony. He needed a woman to cook, clean, and tend his home, but the wedding night never came. Instead, he'd looked at her with contempt. "I can't do it," he'd said. "I've changed my mind." "You're not what was promised." The next morning, while he was out tending to his cattle, Elizabeth had gathered what little she owned and fled, shame burning deeper than any physical pain ever could. Now, after days of aimless wandering, she found herself on this desolate mountain trail, her strength fading with the daylight. Ahead, the trail dropped away sharply. Elizabeth approached the edge, looking down at the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below. Her hand reached for the small pistol she'd taken from her husband's drawer, the only thing she'd stolen besides some bread and a canteen of water. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Elizabeth raised the pistol to her temple. What was left for her now? A life of shame, returning east as damaged goods, or trying to survive alone in this merciless territory. "God forgive me," she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Ma'am, I wouldn't do that if I were you." The deep voice startled her so badly she nearly fell over the edge. Elizabeth spun around, the gun still in her hand, now pointed at a tall, broad-shouldered black man sitting atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. He wore a weathered duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over intense dark eyes that regarded her with concern rather than judgment. "Stay back," Elizabeth warned, her voice trembling as she shifted the gun back to her own temple. "This doesn't concern you. When someone's about to die on land adjoining mine, it becomes my concern," the man replied calmly, dismounting with fluid grace despite his imposing size. He kept his distance, hands visible at his sides. "Name Solomon Ward. I own the Triple W Ranch just over that ridge." "Please," Elizabeth's voice broke, "just go away. Let me do this in peace." Solomon took a careful step forward. "Peace isn't what you'll find that way, ma'am. Whatever brought you to this ledge, it can't be solved by jumping off it. Kill me now," she whispered, tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. "I have nothing left." Solomon's expression remained steady, his voice gentle but firm. "No, you'll live with me." Elizabeth blinked in confusion. "What?" "Not like that," he clarified quickly. "My sister and her children live at my ranch. We have room, food, work that needs doing. Whatever you're running from, you'll be safe there until you figure out your next steps." "You don't understand," Elizabeth said bitterly. "Look at me. I'm damaged, unwanted. Even my husband of 3 days couldn't bear the sight of me." Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly. Some men can only see with their eyes, not with their hearts. He extended his hand, palm up. "The gun, please. Then we can talk about what comes next." Elizabeth's hand trembled. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Solomon said quietly. "I know what it's like when the world decides you're not worthy of basic dignity. Now please, give me the gun, Miss Elizabeth Turner, or I was, before." Her voice trailed off. "Elizabeth," Solomon repeated. "I can't force you to choose life, but I can offer you shelter, food, and honest work before you make your final decision. Is that not worth at least one more day?" For the first time in days, something flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. Not hope exactly, but perhaps curiosity. Slowly she lowered the pistol. Solomon didn't rush forward. He waited patiently, hand still extended. One day at a time. That's how we all get by out here. After what seemed like an eternity, Elizabeth placed the gun in his hand. Her legs buckled then, the full weight of exhaustion and hunger catching up with her. Solomon moved swiftly, catching her before she hit the ground. "Easy now," he murmured, his strong arms supporting her. "Let's get you somewhere warm." As consciousness faded, Elizabeth heard him speaking softly to his horse, felt herself being lifted onto its back. The last thing she remembered was the strange comfort of a stranger's steady presence behind her, and wondering if she had made the right choice, or merely postponed the inevitable. If you're captivated by Elizabeth and Solomon's story so far, make sure you're subscribed to the Black Rancher channel. We bring these forgotten chapters of American history to light because they matter. They show us that dignity and humanity existed even in our darkest chapters. Hit that like button if you're ready for Chapter 2, and share this video with someone who appreciates powerful stories that history tried to erase. The Triple W Ranch sprawled across a protected valley, sheltered from the worst of the mountain winds by tall pines and natural ridges. As Solomon's horse carried them down the final slope, Elizabeth stirred, taking in the sight of the well-maintained buildings, a substantial 2-story main house built of solid timber, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. Unlike many frontier homesteads, there was an orderliness to the Triple W that spoke of prosperity and care. Neat fencing enclosed paddocks where several fine horses grazed. A small apple orchard, now bare for winter, stood to one side of the property. "You live here alone?" Elizabeth asked weakly, her throat parched. "No, ma'am," Solomon replied. "My sister Harriet and her 3 children live with me. Youngest is 8, oldest is 15. Before Elizabeth could respond, the front door of the house burst open. A tall, slender woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. Her resemblance to Solomon was unmistakable, the same strong features, the same watchful eyes. "Solomon Ward, you were supposed to be back before sundown." Harriet's words died as she noticed Elizabeth. "Who's this?" Solomon dismounted smoothly before helping Elizabeth down. She swayed on her feet, and he kept a steadying hand on her elbow. "This is Elizabeth Turner. She needs our help," he said simply. Harriet's expression shifted instantly from suspicion to concern. "Lord have mercy, child. You look half frozen." She hurried forward, taking in Elizabeth's tattered wedding dress and exhausted state. "Come inside, quickly, Daniel," she called over her shoulder. "Put more water on to heat." A young boy appeared in the doorway, eyes widening at the sight of the bedraggled stranger. "Yes, Mama," he said before disappearing back inside. Elizabeth found herself ushered into a warm kitchen that smelled of fresh bread and stew. 2 girls looked up from a table where they'd been shelling peas, their curious eyes taking in the newcomer. "Girls, "This is Miss Elizabeth. She'll be staying with us for a while," Harriet announced, brooking no argument. "Jessie, fetch one of my dresses and some warm stockings. Mary, pour our guests some cider and set another place for supper." The quiet authority in Harriet's voice set the children in motion without question. Solomon had remained by the door, removing his coat and hat. "I'll see to Thunderclap," he said, referring to his horse. "Harriet will take good care of you, Elizabeth." After he left, Harriet guided Elizabeth to a chair by the fire. "Now, I won't ask any questions tonight. You need food, rest, and warmth first. Tomorrow is soon enough for explanations." Elizabeth clutched the mug of hot cider the younger girl handed her. "Why are you doing this? You don't know anything about me." Harriet's eyes softened. "I know my brother wouldn't have brought you here if you weren't in genuine need. That's enough for tonight." For the first time since her disastrous wedding, Elizabeth felt tears well up that weren't born purely of despair. The simple kindness of these strangers was almost too much to bear. Later, bathed and dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loosely on her frame, Elizabeth sat at the family table. Solomon said a brief grace before the meal began. The children were curious but polite, following their mother's lead in not asking direct questions about the stranger. "Miss Elizabeth, do you know how to read?" asked Mary, the middle child, as she passed a plate of cornbread. "I do," Elizabeth replied. "I was a schoolteacher back east before—" "A schoolteacher?" Harriet exclaimed. "Well, isn't that providential? The children have been learning their letters from books and what I remember, but a proper teacher." She glanced at Solomon, who was quietly eating his stew. "Would you consider teaching them while you're here?" Harriet continued. "We can't pay much, but—" "I'm not staying," Elizabeth interrupted, then flushed at her own rudeness. "I mean, I don't want to impose." "Where will you go?" Solomon asked, his first words since sitting down to supper. Elizabeth stared at her barely touched food. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then it seems to me you're exactly where you need to be right now," he said with finality, returning to his meal. That night, in a small but clean bedroom under the eaves, Elizabeth lay awake long after the household had gone quiet. She fingered the scars on her face, feeling the familiar ridges and depressions that had shaped her entire life. Her intended husband's words echoed in her mind. "You're not what was promised." Yet here, in this household of strangers, no one had recoiled from her appearance. No one had mentioned her scars. They had simply seen a person in need and responded with decency. It was more kindness than she had experienced in years. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in hushed white. Elizabeth watched the flakes swirling past her window until exhaustion finally claimed her. The following days established a rhythm. Elizabeth gradually regained her strength, began helping with household chores, and indeed started teaching the children for a few hours each day. They were bright and eager to learn, especially Daniel, who devoured books with remarkable speed. Solomon was often absent during daylight hours, tending to ranch business. When present, he was quiet but attentive, watching Elizabeth with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not pity, certainly not desire, but something else, a kind of careful respect. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Elizabeth found herself alone with Solomon on the porch. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the vast Colorado sky. "Your sister told me about your parents," Elizabeth said softly, "that they were born enslaved, but you were born free in Ohio." Solomon nodded, his profile strong against the starlight. "We were fortunate. Many weren't." "She said your father taught himself to read using discarded newspapers, then taught your mother, and you children." "He believed education was the only freedom that couldn't be taken away," Solomon confirmed. "Even when the law said we couldn't attend school, he made sure we learned." Elizabeth wrapped her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Is that why you've welcomed me? Because I'm a teacher?" Solomon turned to face her fully. "I welcomed you because you needed welcoming. The teaching is a blessing, but it wasn't the reason." "Then what was?" she pressed. His dark eyes held hers steadily. "When I saw you on that cliff, I recognized something. Not just despair, though there was plenty of that. I saw someone who'd been told their whole life they weren't enough, weren't worthy." He paused. I know something about that. Elizabeth looked away. My husband. He couldn't bear to look at me. These scars. Her hand moved unconsciously to her face. That man wasn't your husband in any way that matters, Solomon said firmly. A piece of paper and a ceremony don't make a marriage. Commitment does. Respect does. His voice softened. As for your scars, they're just proof you survived something that might have killed others. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken understanding. Why did you say it that way? Elizabeth finally asked. When you found me. You'll live with me. Not, I'll help you, or come to my ranch. Those specific words. Solomon's mouth curved in a slight smile. Sometimes a person needs to hear a decision made for them when they can't make it themselves. You needed to know someone had decided you should live, even when you couldn't decide it yourself. As the stars wheeled overhead, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. Not healing exactly, not yet, but perhaps the first recognition that healing might someday be possible. This is the Black Rancher channel, bringing you stories of courage and dignity from America's untold history. If you're moved by Solomon and Elizabeth's journey so far, take a moment to subscribe and share this video. These aren't just stories, they're powerful reminders of our shared humanity across all divides. The next chapters reveal challenges that will test them both in ways they never imagined. Stay with me, the most shocking revelations are yet to come. December arrived with heavy snows that isolated the W Ranch from the nearest town. Inside the main house, Christmas preparations were underway. Pine boughs decorated the mantelpiece, and Harriet supervised the children making simple ornaments from dried apple slices and pine cones. Elizabeth had been at the ranch for nearly a month, finding unexpected purpose in teaching the children and assisting with household duties. The constant physical work and regular meals had brought color back to her cheeks. While the scars remained, she found herself touching them less frequently, no longer flinching when catching her reflection in the wash basin. One afternoon, as Elizabeth helped Mary with her sewing, Harriet entered the sitting room with a letter in hand, her expression troubled. Solomon just got back from town. The passes cleared enough yesterday for mail delivery. She hesitated, glancing at Elizabeth. There's a letter. For you. Elizabeth froze. For me. But no one knows I'm here. It's addressed to Mrs. Elizabeth Holloway, in care of Solomon Ward W Ranch. Harriet extended the envelope. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she took it. The name Holloway, her brief husband's surname, felt foreign now. How did he find me? She whispered. I'll give you some privacy, Harriet said, ushering her daughter from the room. Alone, Elizabeth broke the seal and unfolded the single page. Mrs. Holloway, your disappearance has caused me considerable inconvenience and embarrassment. While I understand your feelings were hurt by certain realities of our situation, abandoning your marital duties and stealing my property, namely my father's pistol, are serious matters. I have business near the W Ranch in January and will collect you then. Despite your deception regarding your appearance, a marriage vow is binding before God. I expect you to be ready to return to your rightful place in my household. Your husband, Thomas Holloway. Elizabeth's vision blurred. The walls seemed to close in around her as panic rose in her throat. All the security she'd begun to feel evaporated in an instant. She didn't hear Solomon enter until he spoke. Bad news? Elizabeth looked up, unable to hide her distress. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. Solomon read it quickly, his expression darkening. When he finished, he set the paper down carefully as though it might contaminate him. You don't have to go with him, he said firmly. He's my husband. A husband who drove you to the edge of a cliff, Solomon countered. That paper doesn't say anything about him searching for you out of concern or love. He talks about you like property. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around herself. In the eyes of the law, that's exactly what I am, his property. Women don't have rights in a marriage, Solomon. Especially not women like me. Solomon's jaw tightened. Thomas Holloway is not setting foot on this ranch. You can't stop him, Elizabeth said, rising to her feet. And I won't bring trouble to your family after all you've done for me. When he comes, I'll go with him. It's the proper thing to do. Proper? Solomon's voice rose slightly. Was it proper for him to reject you on your wedding night? To make you feel so worthless that death seemed preferable to living? Solomon, please, Elizabeth pleaded. This isn't your battle. It became my battle when I found you on that cliff, he said quietly. When I told you you'd live with me, I meant it. This is your home now if you want it to be. Elizabeth stared at him, something unspoken passing between them. Why do you care so much? Solomon crossed to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. Because I understand what it means to be judged by appearance rather than character. He turned back to her. And because in the month you've been here, I've seen who you truly are, kind, intelligent, resilient, the kind of woman any man of sense would be proud to call wife. Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. Solomon. I'm not declaring anything improper, he clarified quickly. I'm simply stating facts. You deserve better than Thomas Holloway. Before Elizabeth could respond, a commotion erupted outside, horses approaching, voices calling out. Solomon moved swiftly to the door. Stay here, he instructed, reaching for his coat and hat. Through the window, Elizabeth saw 3 riders approaching the main house. The lead rider, a well-dressed man with a thick mustache, dismounted first. Even from this distance, she recognized Sheriff Daniels from Denver. Solomon met them in the yard, standing tall despite being outnumbered. Elizabeth couldn't hear the exchange, but the tension was visible in the set of Solomon's shoulders. When the sheriff pointed toward the house, Elizabeth's heart sank. They were looking for her. Unable to hide behind Solomon's protection, Elizabeth gathered her courage and stepped outside. The bitter cold hit her immediately, but she barely noticed, focused on the men who had come for her. Mrs. Holloway, the sheriff acknowledged with a tip of his hat. Your husband reported you missing over a month ago. He'll be mighty relieved to know you're alive. Is that what he told you? Elizabeth asked, her voice steadier than she felt. That he was concerned for my welfare. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, whatever disputes you have with your husband are private matters. I'm simply doing my duty in reporting your whereabouts. One of the other riders, a younger deputy, eyed Solomon with open hostility. Sheriff, shouldn't we be asking what this Negro is doing harboring another man's wife? Seems mighty suspicious to me. Solomon's expression remained impassive, but Elizabeth saw his hand tighten into a fist at his side. Miss Turner came to us in distress, Solomon said evenly. My sister and I offered her shelter, as any Christian would. It's Mrs. Holloway now, the sheriff corrected, and while your charity might have been well intended, harboring a married woman without notifying authorities could be construed as something else entirely. The implication hung in the air, dangerous and inflammatory. Elizabeth stepped forward quickly. Sheriff Daniels, I left my husband's home of my own accord after he made it clear our marriage was a mistake. Mr. Ward found me near death from exposure and brought me here to recover. His sister has been present at all times. There has been nothing improper. The sheriff studied her face, both her scars and her resolve. I see. Well, regardless, I'll be informing Mr. Holloway of your location. What happens next is between you and your husband. As the riders prepared to leave, the young deputy leaned from his saddle toward Solomon. You ought to mind your own business, boy. White women ain't your concern. Solomon met his gaze steadily. Any human being in distress is my concern, deputy. That's what separates men from animals. The deputy's face flushed with anger, but the sheriff called him away before the situation could escalate further. As the riders disappeared down the trail, Elizabeth turned to Solomon, despair evident in her eyes. They'll be back. Thomas will come for me. Solomon nodded grimly. Yes, he will, and we'll be ready. That evening, after the children were in bed, Solomon, Harriet, and Elizabeth gathered at the kitchen table. The atmosphere was somber as they discussed their limited options. The law is on his side, Harriet said frankly. As your husband, he has rights over you that no court will dispute. Unless, Solomon began, then hesitated. Unless what? Elizabeth pressed. Unless the marriage itself could be invalidated, he said carefully. Were there any irregularities in the ceremony? Anything that might render it void? Elizabeth thought back to that horrible day. No, everything was legal. The license was filed, the The minister was legitimate. What about his intentions? Harriet asked. Did he misrepresent himself in your correspondence? A flash of realization crossed Elizabeth's face. The advertisements! I still have them. She hurried to retrieve her small valise, pulling out several folded newspaper clippings and letters. Here, he described himself as a kind-hearted rancher seeking companionship in his later years. He said appearance didn't matter to him, that he valued character and gentle disposition above all. Solomon examined the letters. Clear misrepresentation. He lured you here under false pretenses. That's not grounds for annulment, Harriet said gently. Men lie in matrimonial advertisements all the time. Elizabeth's shoulders slumped. Then there's nothing to be done. When he comes, I'll have to go with him. Solomon stood abruptly, pacing the length of the kitchen. There has to be another way. Solomon, Harriet said carefully, you need to consider what's at stake here. Standing against a white man's legal rights to his wife, it could mean more than just legal trouble. The siblings exchanged a loaded glance, communicating decades of shared understanding about the dangers facing black men who defied white authority. I know the risks, Solomon said firmly, but I also know what's right. Elizabeth watched this exchange, suddenly understanding the true magnitude of Solomon's protection. Not just offering shelter, but potentially risking his life and livelihood. I won't let you do this, she said softly. I won't let you put yourself in danger for me. Solomon turned to her, his expression resolute. Elizabeth, when I found you on that cliff, you were ready to end your life rather than return to that man. Has anything changed? She looked down at her hands. No, she whispered. If anything, I have more to live for now. Then it's settled, Solomon said. We'll find a way. As the fire burned low in the hearth, the three continued their counsel, unaware that their conversation was about to be interrupted by a revelation that would change everything. The knock came just before dawn, startling Elizabeth from fitful sleep. From down the hall came sounds of movement, Solomon's heavy footsteps, Harriet's softer ones. Elizabeth threw on her robe and hurried to join them. Solomon was already at the door, rifle in hand. Who's there? He called. Name's Marcus Jenkins, came a weathered voice. I'm looking for Elizabeth Turner, or Holloway as she might be called now. Elizabeth froze halfway down the stairs. Another man looking for her? Solomon glanced back, silently questioning whether to open the door. I'm unarmed, the voice continued, and I've ridden 3 days through snow to find her. It's a matter of family importance. Something in the man's tone, earnest, almost desperate, made Elizabeth nod. Solomon unbolted the door but kept the rifle visible. A tall, thin black man in his 60s stood on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders. Deep lines etched his face, and his beard was more salt than pepper. Most striking were his eyes, a distinctive hazel color that seemed oddly familiar to Elizabeth. Miss Turner? He asked, looking past Solomon to where she stood on the stairs. Yes, Elizabeth replied cautiously. I don't believe we've met, Mr. Jenkins. The man removed his hat, revealing close-cropped grey hair. No, ma'am, we haven't, but I knew your mother, Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, before she married your father, Richard Turner. Elizabeth's breath caught. How did this stranger know her parents' names? Her mother had died when Elizabeth was only 8 years old, and her father had rarely spoken of her afterward. Please come in, Mr. Jenkins, Harriet said, stepping forward. It's freezing out there. Once inside, seated by the fire with a cup of hot coffee, Marcus Jenkins withdrew a worn leather pouch from his coat. I've been looking for you for many years, Miss Turner, he began. After I gained my freedom following the war between the states, I made it my mission to find Sarah's child. How did you know my mother? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins opened the pouch and carefully removed a small daguerreotype. He handed it to Elizabeth. This might help explain. The image showed a much younger Marcus Jenkins, standing beside a beautiful young woman with light skin and striking eyes, the same distinctive hazel color as Jenkins' own. The woman was unmistakably Elizabeth's mother. I don't understand, Elizabeth said, though a cold suspicion was forming in her mind. Sarah Blackwood was my half-sister, Jenkins said simply. We shared a father, though her mother was white and mine was enslaved. Sarah was raised in the main house, educated as a white woman. No one knew of her mixed heritage. It was kept secret even from her. But I knew. My mother told me before she died. Elizabeth stared at the image, then at Jenkins' face, seeing now the subtle resemblance around the eyes, the shape of the chin. That would make you my uncle, Jenkins confirmed. Your mother never knew about her true parentage. She was raised believing she was fully white, and she lived her life accordingly. When she married your father and moved north, our connection was lost entirely. Elizabeth's hands trembled. Are you saying that I'm... You are 1/4 black by blood, Jenkins said gently. Though raised as white, with no knowledge of your heritage. The room fell silent. Elizabeth felt the floor tilting beneath her, her entire understanding of herself suddenly in question. Solomon and Harriet exchanged glances, but remained respectfully quiet. How did you find me? Elizabeth finally managed. Years of searching, I traced your father to Pennsylvania after your mother died, learned you had become a teacher, then discovered you had answered a matrimonial advertisement from Thomas Holloway in Colorado Territory. Jenkins hesitated. I arrived in Denver just days after your wedding. When I heard you had disappeared, I feared the worst. But why look for me at all? Elizabeth asked. After all these years, Jenkins' weathered face softened. Family is family, Miss Turner. When I gained my freedom, I vowed to reconnect whatever branches of our family tree had been severed by slavery and secrecy. You are Sarah's only child, my only living blood relative. Elizabeth stood abruptly, moving to the window. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first pale streaks of dawn illuminating the snow-covered landscape. Does Thomas know? She asked suddenly. Is that why he rejected me? Did he somehow discover... No, Jenkins assured her. No one knows except those of us in this room. Your heritage is not visible in your appearance, especially with... He gestured vaguely toward her scarred face. The smallpox, Elizabeth murmured. All her life she had believed her scars were the reason for rejection, for standing apart. Now she learned there was another separation, one she hadn't even known existed. Solomon cleared his throat. Mr. Jenkins, while this information is clearly important to Elizabeth, I'm not certain why you've traveled so urgently to deliver it now. Jenkins' expression grew grave. Because Thomas Holloway is a dangerous man with powerful connections. When I heard he was searching for his runaway wife, I knew I needed to reach Elizabeth before he did. He turned to Elizabeth. There's something else you should know. Thomas Holloway is heavily involved with a group that violently opposes any rights for former slaves or people of color. His father was a well-known slave trader before the war. Elizabeth sank back into her chair. So if he knew about my heritage, he would do worse than reject you, Jenkins confirmed grimly. Much worse. Harriet, who had been quietly listening, suddenly straightened. But this changes everything legally, doesn't it? If Elizabeth's heritage were to become known... Solomon caught his sister's implication immediately. Miscegenation laws. Colorado Territory prohibits marriage between whites and persons of color. Precisely, Jenkins nodded. If Thomas Holloway were to discover that his wife has black ancestry, however distant, their marriage would be automatically invalidated under territorial law. A strange laugh escaped Elizabeth. Half relief, half bitter irony. So the very blood he would despise me for is what could free me from him. It's a dangerous card to play, Solomon warned. Revealing your heritage would protect you from Holloway legally, but it would also change how society views you entirely. Elizabeth looked between Solomon, Harriet, and her newly discovered uncle. You've all lived with this reality your entire lives, the prejudice, the limitations imposed by others. We have, Jenkins acknowledged. But we were raised knowing who we were. You've lived over 30 years with a different understanding of your place in the world. A long silence fell as Elizabeth absorbed the magnitude of this revelation and its implications. Finally, she squared her shoulders. Mr. Jenkins. Uncle Marcus, she corrected herself, the word strange yet somehow right on her tongue. Thank you for bringing me this truth, however difficult it may be. I need time to consider what it means for my future. Jenkins nodded solemnly. I understand. I'll be staying in the area for as long as needed. You have family now, Elizabeth. Whatever you decide, you're not alone anymore. As dawn broke fully over the Triple W ranch, Elizabeth faced a choice that would redefine not just her marriage, but her very identity. The scars that had marked her face since childhood now seemed trivial compared to the invisible heritage that had shaped her fate without her knowledge. The question remained: when Thomas Holloway came to claim his wife, which truth would she choose to reveal? We're approaching the final chapter of this powerful story on the Black Rancher channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now to make sure you never miss these hidden chapters of American history. These aren't just stories, they're windows into our shared past that help us understand our present. Like this video and share it with someone who appreciates stories about dignity, courage, and finding family in unexpected places. The final revelations in Chapter 5 will change everything you thought you knew about Elizabeth and Solomon's journey. January arrived with bitter winds and even more bitter anticipation. True to his word, Marcus Jenkins had taken a room in the nearest town, visiting the Triple W ranch regularly. Through their conversations, Elizabeth learned about the grandmother she'd never known, the complex family history that had been hidden from her mother, and by extension, from herself. January arrived with bitter winds and even more bitter anticipation. True to his word, Marcus Jenkins had taken a room in the nearest town, visiting the Triple W ranch regularly. Through their conversations, Elizabeth learned about the grandmother she'd never known, the complex family history that had been hidden from her mother, and by extension, from herself. With each passing day, Elizabeth felt herself standing more firmly at the intersection of two worlds: the white society she'd always known and the black heritage she was only beginning to understand. The children accepted Uncle Marcus readily, especially when he revealed his talent for whittling, producing small wooden animals that delighted even 15-year-old Jessie. Solomon watched this unfolding connection with quiet approval, though Elizabeth often caught him studying her when he thought she wasn't looking. Something had shifted between them, not just the revelation of her heritage, but a deepening understanding that transcended their circumstances. One evening, as they sat on the porch despite the cold, Solomon finally spoke the words that had been hovering unspoken between them. "If your marriage to Holloway is invalidated, what will you do after?" Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter. "I've been asking myself the same question. I can't return east, not with what I know now about myself." "You could stay here," Solomon said simply. "The children adore you. Harriet considers you family already." "And you?" Elizabeth asked softly. "What do you consider me?" Solomon turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I consider you the bravest woman I've ever known. Someone who faced death but chose life. Someone who's had her entire understanding of herself challenged, yet still stands tall." His hand moved slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, before gently touching her scarred cheek. "I see beauty here, Elizabeth. Not despite the scars, but including them. They're part of who you are, like your newly discovered heritage." Elizabeth leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. "It's strange. All my life I believed these marks were what set me apart, what made me unlovable. Now I learn there was something else entirely separating me from others, something invisible yet just as powerful." "Perhaps that's why you ended up here," Solomon suggested. "Not by chance, but by some greater design. So you could learn the truth about yourself among people who understand what it means to be judged for who you are." "Do you believe that?" Elizabeth asked. "That we're brought together for reasons beyond our understanding?" Solomon's hand dropped reluctantly from her face. "I believe that good can come from terrible circumstances, if we're brave enough to see it through." He paused. "Elizabeth, when Thomas Holloway comes, and he will come, you need to be certain of your decision. Using your heritage to invalidate the marriage is your right, but once that truth is known, there's no taking it back." "I know," Elizabeth whispered. "I've been thinking about nothing else." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, too many for a social call, especially in the evening. Solomon stood immediately, his hand moving to the rifle that was never far from reach these days. "Get inside," he told Elizabeth. "Find Harriet and the children. Stay away from the windows." Heart pounding, Elizabeth hurried into the house. She found Harriet already gathering the children in the kitchen, away from the front of the house. "Who is it?" Harriet asked, her calm voice belying the worry in her eyes. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "Several riders." Through the kitchen window, they watched Solomon stride purposefully across the yard toward the approaching party. There were 5 men on horseback, with Thomas Holloway unmistakably in the lead. Even at this distance, Elizabeth could see his rigid posture, the self-importance in his bearing. "That's him," she whispered to Harriet. "That's Thomas." The children huddled closer to their mother, sensing the tension. Daniel, now 9, looked up at Elizabeth with worried eyes. "Are they going to take you away, Miss Elizabeth?" Before she could answer, the front door opened and Solomon's voice called out, "Elizabeth, they're asking for you." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth squeezed Harriet's hand. "Whatever happens, thank you. For everything." "We're right here," Harriet assured her. "You're not alone." Elizabeth walked through the house with measured steps, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. At the door, Solomon stood like a sentinel, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can send them away." "No," Elizabeth replied. "This needs to end today, one way or another." She stepped onto the porch, facing the men who had come to claim her. Thomas Holloway sat astride his horse, flanked by the sheriff, the hostile young deputy from before, and 2 other men she didn't recognize. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, no longer the exhausted, frightened woman who had fled his home, but someone who stood with newfound confidence. "Elizabeth," he acknowledged coldly, "you've led me on quite a chase." "Mr. Holloway," she replied, deliberately using his surname rather than claiming any intimacy. Thomas's jaw tightened at the slight. "I've come to take you home, where you belong. Gather your things." "No." The single word hung in the frosty air. Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "This is not a request, Elizabeth. You are my wife. Your place is in my home." "A marriage built on lies is no marriage at all," Elizabeth said clearly. "You advertised for a companion, someone whose character mattered more than appearance. Yet you rejected me the moment you saw my scars." Thomas's face flushed. "That's a private matter between husband and wife. Sheriff, I believe we've established my legal right to reclaim my wife." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mrs. Holloway, I understand you may have grievances, but the law is clear on this matter." "Is it?" Elizabeth asked. "Is the law also clear about marriages between whites and persons of color?" A stunned silence fell over the group. Thomas's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What nonsense is this?" he demanded. Elizabeth gestured toward the house, where Marcus Jenkins now appeared in the doorway. "Allow me to introduce my uncle Marcus Jenkins, my mother's half-brother." Jenkins stepped forward to stand beside Elizabeth, the family resemblance in their eyes now unmistakable when they stood together. "My father was Sarah Blackwood's father as well, though her mother was white and mine enslaved. Elizabeth is 1/4 black by blood, Mr. Holloway." Thomas recoiled as if struck. "This is preposterous. Some scheme cooked up by this Negro rancher to keep you here." "I have documentation," Jenkins replied calmly, pulling out the daguerreotype and several folded papers. "Family records, testimony from those who knew the family, enough evidence to stand up in any court." The sheriff took the offered items, examining them with a frown. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then the marriage would indeed be invalid under territorial law." "It's a lie," Thomas shouted, his face contorted with rage and disgust. "Look at her, she's white. Many who carry black ancestry appear white, Mr. Holloway," Jenkins explained evenly. "It doesn't change the facts of their bloodline." Thomas turned his furious gaze on Elizabeth. "You knew this? You concealed this from me?" "No," Elizabeth replied. "I only learned the truth after I left you. But ask yourself honestly, Thomas, would you have treated me any better if you had known? Or worse?" The question hung unanswered, its answer obvious to everyone present. The young deputy leaned toward Thomas. "Sir, if she's really got colored blood, you're better off without her. The marriage would be null and void anyway." Thomas's expression shifted through rage, disgust, and finally calculated assessment. Elizabeth could almost see him weighing his options, the social embarrassment of a failed marriage versus the far greater scandal of having unwittingly married someone of mixed race. "If what you claim is true," he said finally, "then you were never legally my wife at all." His eyes narrowed with malice. "Though I wonder how your reputation will fare once people learn about your heritage." "I'll take that risk," Elizabeth said steadily. "The truth has set me free in more ways than one." Thomas glared at Solomon, who had remained a silent, powerful presence throughout the confrontation. "You planned this all along, didn't you? Taking in a white woman, turning her against her own kind?" Solomon met his gaze without flinching. "Elizabeth made her own choices, Mr. Holloway. I simply offered her the dignity you denied her." For a moment, it seemed Thomas might order his companions to attack. His hand twitched toward the gun at his hip, but the sheriff, having examined Jenkins's evidence, cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, it appears there are legitimate questions about the validity of your marriage. I suggest we all return to town and allow the judge to examine this evidence properly." Thomas glanced at the other men, realizing he lacked the support needed for any rash action. With a final venomous look at Elizabeth, he yanked his horse around. "Keep her," he spat. "She's tainted goods, in more ways than one." The party rode away, Thomas's rigid back radiating fury. The sheriff lingered momentarily, tipping his hat to Elizabeth. "Ma'am, you'll need to come to town within the week to make a formal statement." "I'll be there," she promised. As the dust settled, Elizabeth stood between Solomon and her uncle, watching as Thomas Holloway, the man who had nearly driven her to end her life, disappeared down the trail, out of her future forever. That evening, the household celebrated with a special dinner. The children were in high spirits, understanding only that Miss Elizabeth would be staying. Harriet had prepared apple pie, and even Solomon seemed more relaxed than he had been in weeks. After the meal, as Harriet supervised the children's bedtime preparations, Elizabeth found herself alone with Solomon in the sitting room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over them both. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Solomon shook his head. "You saved yourself, Elizabeth. You chose to live that day on the cliff. You chose to face Holloway today. Because you gave me the strength to make those choices," she replied. "You showed me that my scars, all my scars, visible and invisible, don't determine my worth." Solomon moved closer, his voice deepening. "What will you do now? Truly?" Elizabeth looked up at him, seeing the question behind the question. "I'd like to stay if you'll have me. Not as a charity case or a hired teacher, but as whatever we might become to each other given time." Solomon's hand found hers, strong fingers intertwining with her more delicate ones. "I told you once that you would live with me. I meant it then, and I mean it now, but for different reasons." "What reasons?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "Because in you, I've found someone who understands what it means to stand between worlds, someone who sees beyond appearances to the truth beneath." His free hand gently traced the outline of her scarred cheek. "Because I believe we were meant to find each other, Elizabeth. Not by chance, but by design." As his lips met hers in a kiss both tender and profound, Elizabeth felt the final pieces of her shattered self falling into place. The woman who had once begged "kill me now" had found not just reasons to live, but reasons to thrive. In a family she never knew she had, in children who loved her without reservation, and in a man who saw beauty where others had seen only flaws. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks of those who had tried to claim her. But within the walls of the Triple W Ranch, Elizabeth had finally claimed her own truth, and with it, a future built on love rather than obligation, on acceptance rather than judgment. As Solomon pulled her closer, his whispered words echoed her transformed heart. "Not kill me now, but love me now. And I do, Elizabeth, I truly do." If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video from the Black Rancher channel. These untold stories from America's past deserve to be heard. Stories of courage, dignity, and love that transcended society's cruel boundaries. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Thank you for staying with Elizabeth and Solomon's journey from despair to redemption. Remember that sometimes our greatest wounds, visible and invisible, lead us to our greatest blessings. Until next time, when we'll share another chapter from the hidden history of the American frontier.